Hi, welcome to another episode of the NPC Sports Podcast. We are at full strength today. Logan has returned from his sojourn in the wilderness. Logan, lovely to see you looking so healthy and vibrant today. Let's hop right in. Patriots offseason. There has been a lot going on. We touched on a lot of the draft stuff last week. But there's just been, I guess, tidbits is the best way to describe the way that the info has been trickling out since the combine began. Set the stage, Dakota, if you want to start us off. Kind of like, what is your impression, or what have been the most noteworthy things that you have seen coming out about the Patriots offseason the last few days?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because this time of the year, you start to get a lot of conflicting information. Like there's one report from a credible reporter who says the Patriots are going to be really heavy on Josh Sweat, and then another says they're not going to be interested. And then you kind of had this sort of media sparring, where not sparring, but there was a report in The Athletic that the Patriots will not be pursuing T. Higgins, and then Mike Giardi of Boston Sports Journal reported the exact opposite thing while sort of couching it, saying like no shot at the other reporter, but I have different information. So it's hard to sort of sift through all that. But I think what appears to be sort of the prevailing theme from what's been coming out of this is that Mike Vrabel is, uh, you know, like being really going about this to try and overhaul the roster, even if it means getting rid of a lot of players who, like you'd want to see stay around and develop, like a Cole Strange, right? We look at Cole Strange and think before he got injured, he was showing promise as a franchise left guard, and they've started this moving him to center experiment. But it looks like they're just, if they think they can upgrade at either guard spot or at center, they're going to do it regardless of Cole Strange. Or, they used a fourth round pick on Layden Robinson last year. A lot of people within the organization last season thought he could be, a real high level guard in the NFL. And now it sounds like they don't care if he's not Vrabel's guy, and if he doesn't think he's going to be an immediate impact starter this season, then they'll just go in another direction. So I think, that we started to hear whispers of this early in the offseason that there could be major roster turnover. The reporting coming out of it sounds like that's going to be the case, and that the sort of main theme is that they're going to target players who are physical, fit what Vrabel likes from a hard-nosed, loving football mentality, which, and tough and big. And that makes you wonder whether someone like Travis Hunter would be appealing to them, given sort of his size. And the other big one that I thought was interesting is this. It seems like the sort of the player atop their rankings is the defensive tackle Milton from the Philadelphia Eagles, and that sort of pairing up with what is starting to sound like more doubtful reporting on Christian Barmore, that he's going to be available next season. If they still had any confidence that Christian Barmore would be able to come back and be a franchise interior defensive tackle, I wonder whether they would be pursuing someone like Milton so hard. So to me, those two things are related.
Talking about Milton Williams, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I got conflicted with Joe Milton in my head.
With Joe Milton, yeah. So I have a question that's kind of rhetorical, but beyond Drake May, is there anyone who is safe on the Patriots roster? Like going into last year,
Christian Gonzalez, for sure.
Christian Gonzalez, sure. Like your first round picks the last 2 years, I'm fine with that. But because I was having the thought of like last year, if you asked me this time last year, like who's a player that I really wouldn't want them to part with, like my answer would probably be Duggar. And like I don't even feel that way about Duggar anymore.
No,
And
I never
so
felt that way about him.
yeah, I bought in the first couple of years of Duggar. I mean, you talk about like physical guys, like that feels like someone who could really thrive depending on how Vrabel used him. It just, but again, after the last 2 years, like for as much as the Patriots like to talk about how they did spend money last year, it was just keeping all these guys in-house. So now we're pretty much talking about guys who are still Belichick guys. Like anyone who's here who didn't sign last year now is a Belichick guy. So like super no loyalty there. And after the way they've played the last 2 years, no one's job should be safe. Like the idea that you can't trade Barmore or this or that, it's like everyone except for Drake May and Christian Gonzalez should be up for discussion. And the reality is that a lot of guys the Patriots have that they conceivably would trade have no trade value, so they would have to cut them anyways. So it's not like they really operate much from a leverage point, but at the risk of being short-sighted, I wouldn't even have a problem with a complete teardown of the roster. Even if they had to rebuild and this year was going to be lean, it's like they need a complete organizational overhaul, which I thought should have been in the form of getting rid of anybody with ties to the past iteration of the Brady Belichick Patriots. They obviously have not gone that route with the coaching staff, but they can at least do it with the personnel. So that's, yeah, I am glad to see that anytime an insider talks about who could get moved for the Patriots, it feels like a new name comes up. Like Ramondre Stevenson's name has been out there. Barmore's name has been out there. Obviously, Godchaw's name was out there.
Yeah, it's interesting because like if I was to name like the other players who I think like 0% chance they're gone, it's not necessarily because there's like they should be untouchable. It's just I don't see any way they trade Christian Barmore because the other team would have no idea how to feel about his health and the Patriots would be selling low. So you're just not going to make that deal. Brendan Schooler to me is someone who like there's no way he's leaving because you don't like teams aren't going to trade
Yeah,
anything
get a
for
seventh round pick for a special teamer.
yeah, so you might as well just keep him, right? And he is a good special teamer. So like those guys I don't think are going to go anywhere, but it's not necessarily to your point because they're elite blue chip talents. I mean, even like you look at the receiver room, their best receiver is Demario Douglas, who I still think can be a really, really good player. I mean, he was disappointing stat wise last year, but I think that was more the circumstances around him. But it's like, does Vrabel believe that a guy with that size, who's a liability as a blocker, does he really want to, lock him into a big role, or would he rather, let's say, trade for Jacoby Myers and bring back sort of the bigger slot to New England? So like even some of the best players at their positions, like you mentioned, Duggar, Jabril Peppers, who the off-field stuff we don't know, like you can make cases for and against keeping all those guys, which is why like they're such a strange roster. The last few years, I feel like you've been able to look at them and squint and see like a 9-win team or a 4-win team. And you could go either way on a lot of these players. But to your point, there's really only 2 or 3 guys who you're like, you have to hold on to those guys. The rest, yeah, I think it's open conversations on all of them.
It will be interesting to see what they do with the defense because that goes to tell you like what they believe about the personnel at least. Because if you go back to presumably the reason they wanted to keep a bunch of guys like Peppers would be because the Patriots in what was 2023 did have a largely actually a very good defense. If you consider how much they were on the field, it actually enhances the idea that like they did have a pretty good unit, but they were so woefully bad last year that it's like, was that a Covington problem? Was that just an entire Mayo coaching staff issue? Or was that a personnel problem? Because if we see a lot of the same guys who have been staples of the defense the last few years come back, then maybe you dream about like, all right, well, with an offense that can be on the field for more than 13 minutes a game, this defense is probably going to be better. But if they go and they tear it all down, then it's like, all right, then they truly believe that this is just, they got more out of a group than they otherwise should have a few years ago.
It does feel like it's about an 80% certainty that Stevenson will be gone. I got to be honest. I would love to see him stay though, just because of like the success Vrabel's had out of the running back position. Obviously, Henry is he's going to have success in anyone's system. But especially for the type of runner that Stevenson is. And I agree with you guys about the teardown, but on offense, yeah, you have Drake May. The rest of it doesn't really matter developmentally, but Stevenson might be the only holdover guy that they have on offense that can make a play outside of May. I mean, even if they do end up with Travis Hunter or so it does feel like they're going to need someone who can make who has proven that they can make a play at the NFL level. So he's not prohibitively expensive, especially if the offensive line gets better. And we've seen him do well. I think he was really ruined by that last awful campaign under Belichick, and obviously the dysfunction under I keep saying OJ Mayo. Spicy Mayo. Gerard Mayo. I'm going to be saying Deron Mayo before too long.
Yeah. Well, not to belabor this point, but it's like, all right, so Stevenson's going to be a free agent after this upcoming season, right? So you trade him
I think he has 2 years left. Maybe the third isn't guaranteed. I'll look.
Okay. That in any event, you trade him, you're probably at best getting a day 3 pick. this year, maybe next year. It's like, why, to your point, Ben, like he is one of a few players on that offense who has shown competence at the NFL level. So you might as well just ride it out because that's like you get nothing in NFL trades. Just ride out the contract with a guy who, even if he slides to be your number 2 running back or something, it's like he's in his mid-20s. He's been productive enough. Like to me, he's more valuable to you than he would be in a trade.
Yeah, and on Steve, so I'm just looking at his contract right now. He's signed for this season and 2026. The cap hit this year is 5.5. The cap hit in 2026 is 7.6, and then he's signed through 2028, but he isn't guaranteed anything in 27 or 28. So that's effectively, he'd either be cut or restructured. But on Stevenson, I think he's kind of an interesting case, sort of to encapsulate the whole offseason, which is, how do we? There's so many things we don't know about what Vrabel wants, what Josh McDaniels wants, because I think with Ramondre Stevenson, if you just remove the fumbles for a second, which I know have to be sort of part of the conversation, but he's shown in the past that he can fix that. So I think it's about scheme fit, because I know a lot of people with the team last year thought a lot of the issues he was having was that they were using him incorrectly, and that's why you saw Antonio Gibson look so much better a lot of the time, where Alex Van Pelt wanted to do this outside zone blocking scheme, which doesn't really suit Ramondre Stevenson's strengths. Like if you're going to have someone that's running that kind of offense as a running back, you want someone who can get outside and then he sees one lane, plant, and then he goes. And he's fast enough to get through there quickly. That's just not Ramondre Stevenson's game. He's a between the tackles, physical guy, keep the chains moving. And so with Josh McDaniels coming back, do the Patriots go back to having a fullback again, right? Do they go back to more power runs, which I would think suit Ramondre Stevenson better than what we've seen the last couple of years when the Patriots tried to do this outside zone stuff? Or is Josh McDaniels now going to sort of try and also continue to go in a different direction than what we've seen the Patriots running game in the past? Because if he's going to come out and sort of call runs like he did with someone like LeGarrette Blount, I see no reason why Ramondre Stevenson can't have a really good season. But if he's just going to kind of go out and run one of these modern NFL offenses with outside zone blocking, I just don't think that suits Ramondre Stevenson well. In which case they should absolutely consider trading him.
Well, I look at him too, like thinking. Sorry, go ahead, Logan. You can go first.
Well, I was just going to quickly say it's funny that they, like, for the last few years have not figured out how to operate with 2 running backs, because literally every other team in the NFL knows how to do that. Like even thinking back, like Sony Michel was overall a bad draft pick because they drafted him high relative to his skill set. But it did make sense because he had stone hands. They knew they weren't going to be able to get him to catch passes, but they had James White, so they didn't have to worry about it. And it was so easily structured, and the play calling was sometimes predictable based on who was on the field, but both of them were good enough at their respective roles that it made sense. So it's like, yeah, it is obvious that Antonio Gibson looked way better because they were running an offense that was suited for him.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I look at him as is he's like almost a proof of concept. Like why, like the Eagles. I look at what they did. They had the proof of concept with Miles Sanders and Boston Scott,
DeAndre Swift,
and all those kind of guys, so that when it came for that generational free agent to choose where he was going to go, he could look at the Eagles offense and say, oh, I like some of the things they've done here. I could fit in here. And I'm not saying that the Patriots' next big free agent investment should be a running back by any stretch of the imagination, but at least he's another thing that it sounds like they're not going to get T. Higgins or any Chris Godwin, any of these other free agent weapons they're trying to land. But next season is another offseason, and you got to be able to show growth this year for those free agents that either you couldn't get or weren't interested in you this year to be interested in you next year.
Yeah, and so the other thing to keep in mind, real quick, if you remove McDaniels' preference out of it for a second and just think, what would Mike Vrabel want? I mean, when he was with the Titans, he absolutely, loved having the big physical lead back and then the smaller, shifty passing down back to spell Derrick Henry. From Dion Lewis when Vrabel first got there. I think Dontrell Hilliard was there, Tyjae Spears in Vrabel's last season. So we're all, again, these sort of smaller passing first compliments to Derrick Henry. So, part of me thinks just run it back with Ramondre Stevenson and Antonio Gibson, because it fits Vrabel's history, and it fits what Josh McDaniels did when he was with the Patriots.
This is probably more a question about the offense, but now this whole discussion about like having a built-in system where you can just plug guys in has made me think, what's the bigger contributing factor to the Patriots' woeful play the last few years? The fact that they've had different people leading, a different person leading the offense essentially each of the last 3 years, maybe four. Or is it just that they lack quality enough personnel? But there really hasn't been a lot of structure. You know, there has been a lot of change in terms of, especially around offensive coordinators, that it's like, is there any semblance of productive players on offense that just need stability, like just need a system that's tailored for them, that's going to be around for more than 1 year? Because that, I think that then changes sort of the blow it all up argument. But I sit there and think, well, if Jalen Polk can't catch a freaking pass with no one around him, I don't care what the system is, he's probably not going to be reliable then.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Before you go, Dakota, I was actually thinking the other day. I think there's a distinct possibility that like we're at the end of October, and a lot of the talk we're saying now about, hey, like the Patriots, the talent cupboard is bare. There's nothing there at athlete, player, personnel wise. I think we could be 8-9 weeks in the season and be realizing that we were maybe not as right about that as we thought, because like yeah, they are at a big talent deficit across the board, but there are like Keishon Boutte is a useful player. Like we've been talking about Stevenson, obviously Drake.
Yeah,
I
Pop Douglas.
there's a reason that they were considered a player for T. Higgins, because if you plug in, if they get an edge rusher in the draft, if they clear up the offensive line, and if they were able to get an outside threat on offense, all of a sudden you're thinking, well, wait a second, they're maybe not as totally bereft as I think a lot of people are assuming.
Yeah, and I think some things are excuses and some things are fair explanations. And I think for the Patriots, one of the big things was the defense last year. And I think it's absolutely fair just to point out all of the injuries and the coaching turnover. Not having Bill Belichick running it. I think that was a huge part of it. Like people always say, you can't make excuses. Every team goes through injuries. I mean, they had some pretty significant injuries, plus the Matthew Judon trade. So I just think, I think I wouldn't shock me at all if the Patriots defense returns to being very good this season without any major additions. But we'll see.
Yeah.
The other thing,
I just,
sorry, continue, Logan.
my thing is just like, every year they draft players that you start to get excited about because they have to draft a receiver in one of the first 2 rounds every freaking year. And it's like, I sat around for a while being like, I get why they like Tyquan Thornton. Like, I can see the vision there, but like, he never showed you anything. And so last year, like, I went into last season thinking like, this team is going to be bad. There are 2 things I want. I would like to be at least a little bit entertained, and I would like for a handful of guys to just freaking show me something. And save for like 2 games, they were entertaining. The Bengals game being one of them. I thought the season was going to go in a much different direction. But like, who did you watch last year? Like, Demario Douglas is probably a good example. Christian Gonzalez, but the expectation is there that he's going to be a shutdown corner. Like, what player do you look at and say like, okay, it is plausible that they would take a jump this year? Like, I don't disagree, Ben. We might be sitting there at the end of October being like, Javon Baker ended up being a lot more talented than we thought because of X, Y, and Z. But has anything that you've seen from him at the NFL level so far indicated that that would happen? Like, I don't think it's that short-sighted to be in this place right now, because nobody except for Drake May and maybe 5 others gave you anything to, think favorably about going into this season. Everyone has to prove something.
Yeah, I think it's tough. Are there any players in there that I think like they could take a step forward to be like Pro Bowl level players this year? I don't know about that, but like I look at players who like Del Pettis, right? Like they were down the stretch last season, he was an undrafted rookie. I mean, he was their best safety for the last like quarter of the season. And Jabril Peppers, with being the physical player that he is, depending on how the team feels about the off-field stuff. Like those two guys being, I think, legitimate options. And Peppers is still only like 27 or so. Like, does that facilitate a Kyle Duggar departure? Them cutting Marte Mapu, you know, Marcus Jones, who's I think on the whole before he got hurt at the very end of the year, I think was having a really good season, finally showing the ability in slot corner. So I think there are some players who like I wouldn't be surprised if they truly emerge as legitimate NFL starters, Pro Bowl players. That's probably not. The only other point I wanted to make quickly was Logan, you mentioned the constant change and turnover, like with offensive coordinators and everything. I think the other big thing there that kind of gets overlooked is the turnover at offensive line coach, because really the offensive line coach and the coordinator they go hand in hand. Like they need to complement each other. And the Patriots have had a different one every year since 2019. In 19, you had Scarnecchia. That was his last year. And then in 2020, I believe it was Carm Brasillo and Cole Popovich leading it together. Popovich left because I think he refused to get the vaccine. Then after the 2021 season, McDaniels took Brasillo to Vegas. And then in 2022, you had the Matt Patricia disaster. 2023, you had Adrian Clem, who didn't do a good job anyway, and then left midway through the season for a health issue. And then last year, you had Scott Peters come in and install this whole new strike-based system, and now he's gone, and now you have Doug Marrone. So that's as big of it as anything, and part of the reason why they haven't been able to develop offensive linemen is they have a different coach in their year every season. So you hope finally that starts to change going forward. But again, who knows? Because we don't know how Doug Marrone's going to do.